Here comes the battle over CBDCs and the Federal Reserve. Now, today, you're hearing about central bank digital currencies everywhere. It's all over the news cycle, and of course, news that the Federal Reserve wants to roll out their own central bank digital currency. It's such a hot topic that it seems like it might be one of the main talking points between presidential candidates in the next election. We see lawmakers passing bills to prevent central bank digital currencies from happening, but do they really have the power to do that? And that is the topic of this conversation I'm having with presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy. We're going to dig into the censorship industrial complex, and if he could be elected president, what would he do about this? Now, Vivek is a young candidate, but I'm hopeful that he might have a chance at doing this. He's bringing a new sense of urgency. He is crazy smart. And once you listen to this conversation, you might agree, but I'd like to hear. We're going to talk about the censorship industrial complex. We're going to talk about the censorship of not just speech, but also money through central bank digital currencies, how he thinks the power of the president could control, potentially stop central bank digital currencies, how the power of the president could stop and limit the surveillance of the state, what he would do to overhaul social media. We're going to talk about Fed policy, what he could do to manage inflation, the debt ceiling, his plan to bring economic prosperity back to the United States. We're going to find out what his viewpoint is on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and so much more. It's an amazing interview, a very short one, a fast one, because he is crazy smart and articulate. So let's go ahead and just jump right in with Vivek. All right, Vivek, thanks for taking the time from your campaign trail to come talk to me. I know you've been super busy. I see you everywhere. You're definitely getting the reps in, and I love what you're saying. You're hitting a bunch of data points. So let's just go ahead and just jump right into some of the questions that I kind of have and some of the things that I think I'm kind of concerned with and my audience would be concerned with. And so the big topic that I see, and I actually recorded an episode of my radio show the other day saying that I think this is the single most important issue of our generation and maybe multiple generations, and that is censorship. Mm-hmm. And we're being censored in a bunch of ways, from communication, speech, our money, all different types of things. So I want to start with that, the censorship industrial complex.
Amen.
It's a big topic. I think it's one of the most important topics, like I said. And it seems like we went from enlightened liberalism to now woke totalitarianism. Speech, like I said, financial transactions, movements. So let's just start with the surveillance state that we have and what you're thinking about that. We saw the Biden administration put together this DHS disinformation governance board. Obama has been on board, in Stanford calling for regulation of online speech. Now there's this Restrict Act that's been put forth, I think 25 high-ranking Republicans and Democrats on this bill, which to me seems like the single most dangerous piece of legislation, period. What are your thoughts on that? What do you think about that moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a very big topic. I think that the number one unique threat to free expression in the 21st century, particularly today, is not just government directly silencing speech through the front door. I think the real threat is now when the government is deputizing private mechanisms to action, private actors, to do through the back door what government never could get done through the front door under the Constitution. So it says, we're the government. We can't censor your speech. But guess what they'll do? Now they'll threaten internet companies. We can go through the banking version of this in the ESG movement, but let's just stick to the social media version of this for now. We'll just threaten a private company to say that we want it to take down certain forms of disfavored speech or misinformation or hate speech and so on, to implement through the back door what it could not get done through the front door under the Constitution. That's state action in disguise. It is lurking state action. That's actually the real threat that we face. And then they go further. They give him an attaboy on the back. They give him a little bit of a special wrapper in the form of, for example, social media companies, internet companies, getting a special form of federally endowed immunity, Section 230C2 protection, that gives them a special cloak of immunity. So one of the ways I like to explain this to people is people get lost in the present, right? And then they take their partisan stance and have a lot of difficulty separating themselves from their partisan perspective. History offers some interesting lessons where when, say, a bookstore owner, in a case called Bantam Books, wanted to sell a book, but a local prosecutor didn't like the book. What did the prosecutor say? He said, I'm going to prosecute you unless you take down that book. Now, a customer who wanted to buy that book later sued the bookstore owner and said, you took down this book I wanted to buy. Normally, that would have been laughed off the stage because that's just a private bookstore owner deciding what he does and doesn't want to sell. But the Supreme Court said not so fast. That was actually state action in disguise because it was the government censoring that customer from being able to buy the book, not the bookstore owner doing it directly. If it's state action in disguise, the Constitution still applies. And then there's an analogy to the immunity that government uses to coax these private companies into taking action that they otherwise wouldn't have taken to censor content, except this related to the war on drugs. When the government wanted to fight the war on drugs, they would rather have searched and seized, drugs or potential drugs off of every person they could find. But this pesky thing called the Fourth Amendment gets in the way. So they passed a law that gave railroads a special form of immunity that immunized those railroads from being sued by passengers if those passengers were searched by the railroad, even against their consent. They said, oh, that's just a private company. Again, the Supreme Court said not so fast. If they're inducing a private company, even a railroad company, through immunity to do what the government couldn't directly do to accomplish a government objective, that was still a situation where the private actor's conduct, the railroad company in this case, was subject to the constraints of the Fourth Amendment. So I bring that back because the threats to censorship today are mostly implemented, not directly through the front door showing up at your doorstep with the police saying you can't say something. That's what allows them to get away with saying that, oh, yes, Joe Biden speaks at the White House Correspondents' Dinner a week and a half ago or whatever, and I was there waxing eloquent about protecting the First Amendment. They're able to get away with the farce because they're just doing their dirty work through the back door instead. Part of what I'm looking to do as U.S. president is to disabuse ourselves of that farce and actually recognize that state action in disguise is still state action, and that means the Constitution still applies. So, I know we got pretty thick there pretty quickly, but, time is scarce and I wanted to get into the substance. That's how I look at it.
Yeah, I mean, it's always that pesky document called the Constitution that seems to get in the way, as you said. I like that reference. In regards to that specifically, we saw through the Twitter files, it got blown wide open that the government is working directly with these corporations to do just kind of what you're saying. And so you think it's the 230 that if you were able to repeal that, take away those protections, then that would help protect the platforms and being able to give that privacy back, or not the privacy, but the ability to kind of freely speak?
Yeah, I would make section. So there's two parts to Section 230. There's Section 230C1, which is not relevant to this discussion. That's the part that says these platforms aren't liable for what individual users post. Put that to one side. Right. Section 230C2 says that even if there are states, and there are states in this country that prevent you from discriminating based on political expression or whatever else, that nonetheless the company can't be sued under those state laws, because Section 230C2 gives them a special blanket of immunity to the company. Well, what I say is let's make that an opt-in statute. If you want that special form of immunity, you can have it, but then you're subject to the same constraint as the federal government itself, right, which is the First Amendment. You can't have both ways to say you get the special governmental form of immunity without being subject to the First Amendment in the standards of what you do and don't take down. So that's where I land on that, is if something is truly not protected speech, like spam or hardcore pornography, fine, you could take it down. That's what Section 230C2 allows you to do without being sued. But if it's protected by the First Amendment, if it's political expression, then you can't take it down and not expect to be sued for it under states that protect that form of expression.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it gets tricky when you say, well, what is protected and what isn't. So now they're saying first it was a threat to the democracy or a threat to national security, and now it's a threat to people, hate speech and things like that. And so who calls that line on what hate speech is?
We have good doctrine on this, though. We have good doctrine on this. I think that I do hear that response a lot. Yeah. The expression of an opinion is always protected under the First Amendment. That's the hard. I mean, you can't say something fraud. There's fraud laws that prevent you from uttering words that are false for commercial gain. There's all kinds of speech that is not constitutionally protected speech. But the shorthand version is if you're expressing an opinion, it is protected. That means hate speech goes away as a category.
I like that. So on the next form of censorship, and I think that money is communication. It expresses my communication of value for that good or service that I want, and I believe that all freedom comes from the freedom to transact. So even though the Constitution guarantees me a freedom of assembly, if I can't pay to put gas in my vehicle, I can't go assemble. If I can't buy food when I'm there, I can't assemble speech, etc. And so then another form of communication would become censorship of financial transactions. We're already seeing a lot of that in the banking sector today through types of capital controls. I know trying to send wire transfers over six figures gets a lot of problems for me all the time already. And now we're starting to see this get really ramped up with central bank digital currencies. And this seems to be potentially a topic that's going to be on this next platform. We see lawmakers like Ron DeSantis, Ted Cruz, Tom Emmer, et cetera, kind of aggressively trying to prohibit these federal CBDCs from coming in. I guess what's your stance on that?
So I'm dead set against CBDCs. I was talking about this long before it was popular to be a talking point in political circles. As much as I respect a governor who wants to take action against this is, fiat currency is a federal issue, right? So I think anything short of the right actor, which is to say the federal government, putting a stop to it, you're not going to be able to, do anything other than make a political point by trying to take this on at the state level, although I don't blame someone for trying. It needs to be done at the federal level because the federal government is what backstops our currency. So converting that currency into a digital currency, I think, is something that is downright dangerous. Why is it dangerous? It allows the government to implement a social credit scoring system into how they actually erase value from your own bank accounts. Now, this is not made up stuff. I mean, look at those truckers in Canada that participated in a protest last year expressing an opinion. They had their bank accounts or credit cards, ultimately credit denied to them, losing money. Government is weaponizing the financial system to implement what it couldn't necessarily do through the usual mechanisms. The usual argument that we hear in this country for central bank digital currencies is that China's doing it and that we have to keep up with the Joneses, or as I sometimes joke around, keep up with the Jinpings.
Yeah.
I think that doesn't make sense because China's reason for adopting it is exactly what should concern us, which is power, dominion, control, and punishment. It is the ability to punish individual citizens for what they say by using their wallets as the way to get them to conform. That should cause us to run in the other direction, not to say that we want to copy China. And to the people who will say, well, that's going to make the dollar less competitive or less strong relative to the yuan if we're not as technologically advanced in having a digital option, I argue it the other way. I say the dollar should be stronger if it can't be confiscated at the whim of a partisan government that's in power. Yet that's exactly what CBDCs are designed to do. And so that's why I stand unapologetically and firmly against it. And I think we require a U.S. president in this country that actually understands those issues deeply to be able to actually guard and hold the line against that excess and that overreach.
Yeah. Now, with President Trump, we saw really an increase in kind of this rhetoric against the Federal Reserve and sort of kind of pressuring the Federal Reserve to ease policies for the economy and things like that. And so the Federal Reserve is this quasi, semi-private institution that's supposed to be somewhat independent, and it seemed like Trump really started pressuring that. And so if you have the Federal Reserve that's would be the central bank digital currency, how does the independent central bank, the Federal Reserve, be influenced by a potential presidential candidate or president, for that matter, if it does have that independence?
Well, a lot of that could be done through the Treasury. So the U.S. Treasury Department is actually what's advancing some of the plans for central bank digital currencies as well. I think that the printing of money happens at the U.S. Treasury, right? So the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury work together. Right. So I think that the Treasury is one mechanism. But then the deeper point is the Federal Reserve, the independence of the Federal Reserve is really just artifice. I think the president meets with the chairman of the Federal Reserve regularly. I think he selects who's appointed into that position when terms expire. So I think this idea of independence is usually designed to, I don't want to say dupe the public, but to create a form of independence and legitimacy that doesn't actually exist. I'm not even saying that I think that independence is a good thing. I think that I don't love unaccountable bureaucrats being accountable to no one in that federal government. But I think that idea of independence itself is a bit illusory, and the Treasury plays a role here as well. So it's not the kind of thing that's somehow immunized from political interference. To the contrary, we see political influence all the time. And I think we could be in the worst of all worlds where people believe that the reason their money's being wiped out in their bank account had nothing to do with politics, when in fact it absolutely did. And that would be a version of the Chinese model right here in the United States. And it's not going to happen under my watch. And that's why I've been pretty vocal about that as part of my platform for U.S. president.
Yeah, it's a big deal. It all works in there together. Just for the audience, the head of the BIS, and I want to get into some more of the global stuff in a minute, but the head of the BIS was out and saying, we don't know who uses the 100 bill today or the 1,000 peso today, but with CBDCs that would change. We'll have total control. Christine Lagarde, head of the ECB, said that we could give some privacy for transactions of a few $100s, but even that could be a problem because even a $100 transaction could lead to protests. And what is she saying there, right? She's saying we can't allow even people to control 100 because they might not like something we're doing and might have something to say about that. And so the total control, and so it's a very, very dangerous thing. Talking about the Fed and the quasi semi-independence of that, you kind of have this Fed policy right now. It's sort of insane that we look to Jerome Powell in these FOMC meetings every single time, sort of like Punxsutawney Phil, like this groundhog. He's going to come out and tell us what the weather's like, and now we have to look at the Fed, and he's going to tell us what the future of what our fate is. Are they going to ease restrictions, or are we going to go into recession and lose everything? Right? He's trying to crush demand, so to speak. I guess what would be your policy in dealing with the Fed? I mean, it seems like they're trying to hold firm right here. They're trying to reduce demand, keep inflation down, while the government is trying to increase the debt ceiling, which would only be more inflationary. But we're sort of in this damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Not a very good situation to come on board and have to deal with. What's your view on that?
What I propose is deeper structural reform of the Federal Reserve System itself. I mean, we have over 22,000 employees in there. I've said I would implement an over 90% headcount reduction, but not just for its own sake. It's to put the Federal Reserve back in its place, which is to have one narrow function: stabilize the U.S. dollar, period. Not anything more than that. Stabilize the dollar as a unit of measurement. You know what? We've had our biggest GDP growth in this country during periods when actually the dollar was pegged to the gold standard and then was actually at least kept stable by the Federal Reserve even after we went off the gold standard. But when the dollar is volatile, that's an impediment to GDP growth. If the number of minutes in an hour varied, you and I probably wouldn't be talking to each other at the same time because one of us would be on the Skype interface at one point, the other one would be on a different one. That's what happens to capital allocation in an economy. It's inefficient when the dollar is this volatile. And so I could go on and talk about in some level of detail how when the Fed tries to hit two targets with one arrow, inflation and unemployment, it misses both. It's been a disastrous 25-year experiment. But what I would do, the punchline is, put the Fed back in its place, stabilize the U.S. dollar as a unit of measurement, period, nothing more. I don't need 22,000 of you to do that. I probably don't even need 2,000 of you. That's an over 90% headcount reduction. And it's also a lesson in administration, which is that when you have thousands of people show up to do a job that they shouldn't have been doing in the first place, they find things to do and usually mess it up. And I think that's a deeper cancer in the administrative state overall. It's definitely a problem with the Federal Reserve, and that's part of why I've been crystal clear as U.S. president. I would fix that in a heartbeat, and that's a big part.
I'd like to ask a little bit more detail on how you might actually do something like that, because from my viewpoint, and I think a lot of people's viewpoint, maybe from a more of an Austrian lens, anytime you're manipulating the money supply, you're going to get this volatility. How would you go about stabilizing the currency that way?
Take a basket of commodities and peg the dollar to it. So it's like the equivalent of going back to the gold standard, except instead of just gold, you use a basket of commodities, including commodities like gold, silver, nickel, and so on, but also farm-based commodities, a broad basket of commodities, stabilize the U.S. dollar against that, period. That's how I do it.
It could work. I mean, it would put the government back into some form of austerity, which is never popular.
Yes. No, but I think it would be actually reasonably popular if explained to the American people in the context of my GDP growth agenda. So I'm talking about unshackling the U.S. energy sector. I say no to this climate cult. Drill, frack, burn coal, embrace nuclear. We're going to take the take the straitjacket off the American economy, put people back to work, stop paying people to stay back home. So a lot of what I'm doing elsewhere is part of a radical pro-growth agenda in this country. Measured against that backdrop, absolutely this kind of reform of the Federal Reserve, stabilizing that dollar against the basket of currencies, actually feeds into more of that GDP growth. So I think it will be quite popular as part of a broader pro-growth policy.
So then the argument would be that it would be somewhat of an austerity measure because you can't increase the money supply arbitrarily. However, if you go into some pro-growth policies, then you could increase the growth, and then you would be able to offset it that way. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the American public isn't very
more than offset it. I think that actually this would further foster that growth itself, because a lot of that spending from the government are themselves anti-growth policies directed towards, for example, subsidizing people to stay home, which itself is an impediment to GDP growth. So I don't think it's just an offset. I think it's part of a broader pro-growth agenda. It's an amplifier of that pro-growth agenda itself.
A lot of the well, I was going to say, unfortunately, I hate to say this, but a lot of the public is somewhat, let's say, uneducated, if not ignorant, about these types of policies. They don't understand how the sausage is made. They don't understand how value is created or transferred. And so to sell this to the public at a time when that would be pulling back incentives or I should say entitlements to them in light of a trade-off of having a better future, of having this pro-growth, would be very difficult. I've often thought that any candidate running on a campaign to reduce benefits to anybody is probably going to have a slim chance of being elected. Does that seem like it's a threat to you?
Well, look, that's why I kind of frame it a little bit differently. Democrats talk about dealing with national debt through tax increases. Republicans talk about express spending cuts. I'm framing what I'm doing as offering a better third way, economic growth itself, which means we all make more money. And so I think that actually that message in a bipartisan way has been resonating quite a bit. I mean, I'm talking mostly to Republican audiences since we're in the middle of a primary, but even independents and Democrats, I think, come along with the message where the plan is we all make more money through what we actually produce. And I think that that's the right way to handle this rather than the way Republicans might otherwise handle it, which is just talking about which spending cuts we need to get the House in order. Put that to one side, do that against the backdrop of GDP growth, you then have actually much more consensus around which to deliver that. So I think it's actually going to be a political winner for us. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, instead of having to choose one negative over another, maybe you can kind of have both, to your point, a third option in the middle that could drag it forward. So it seems like, anytime a nation has gotten this high of a debt to GDP, it's always spelled disaster. We're sort of teetering on the brink of that at 120, 125% debt to GDP level. Really, when we get over like a 90% debt to GDP, the debt just drags down the economy so much.
Again, there's two ways to play with that ratio. One of them is to make GDP go up. So that's a big part of the unleashing the energy sector, putting people back to work that I'm talking about. But you're saying it exactly the right way. I just wanted to remind you, debt to GDP, there's still an ingredient there called GDP that we're able to use to control for that.
Sure. Even with the Fed policy right now where they're trying to crush demand, right? That's one side of the equation. If inflation was too high, you could also add more goods and services to the economy.
Yes.
You don't have to just crush demand.
Oil, gas, et cetera. That's a big driver of that inflation too. So yes, we're purposefully constricting supply in the name of some climate agenda, and I think that's a big part of the problem.
And then on top of that, what about the regulations? Because regulations themselves are inflationary. I mean, I think Trump had run on a campaign of repealing 3 regulations for every new one that was imposed, which I think he had actually exceeded. I would imagine you must have some policy to pull back lots of regulations.
Oh yeah, I mean, pro-growth and deregulatory go hand in glove together. Right. I just think in certain cases we have to take some of these government agencies and shut them down, because I think the problem is long after the president is gone, the managerial class and that leviathan, that beast in the administrative state lives on. That's why I'm not just focused on reforming the administrative state. I want to gut it. We will be shutting down many of those government agencies. We've already identified a list that we have to shut down, and agencies that, frankly, will never come back. And I think that'll be for the better of the country.
What about, you are a very young presidential candidate, which I'm in favor for. I've seen what's happened in El Salvador with President Bukele. He's done an amazing job. I feel like you kind of get this new energy. I'm afraid that we have 75 and 80-year-olds in office that are making policies on cutting-edge technology that would be that would be a massive mistake restricting these policies, specifically around cryptocurrencies and AI. I mean, you got Elizabeth Warren literally running on an anti-crypto policy. Now Kamala is going to regulate AI.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. I can think of no greater disaster for humanity than putting Kamala Harris in charge of AI. But let's think about, the AI debate for a second. I mean, this is where I get people to just pause. What do you think happens if we apply handcuffs to the United States, but China still roams free? You think you've actually, let's take legitimate risks. Do you think you've controlled those risks, or do you think you've actually made them worse? Well, if China's not adopting those same constraints, why on earth would we adopt those constraints either? Now, I think there are risks, but it's like gain-of-function research. It didn't stop a global pandemic. It created one. Yet in the name of stopping a global pandemic, and even in the name of even having banned it here in the United States, it went to China and, unleashed hell on the world thereafter. So I think people need to just think a little bit more clearly about some of these more complex threats rather than just engaging in the virtue signaling of saying something about it. I think that cryptocurrency regulation is, our existing financial markets are already burdened by a cumbersome regulatory regime that crypto and Bitcoin offer at least an alternative scaffold that we could actually learn from to understand how broken our existing security and commodities regulation infrastructure is in this country. Instead, they're running in the other direction to say we're going to ensnare the new thing in that existing framework as well. I think it should be the other way around. I think that having an opt-out system actually takes us back to the first principles that should govern the way we regulate other securities and commodities already under a broken regime. So that's where I land on that.
Now, I know our time's running short, so I don't know, maybe we'll have time for one more question, but
yeah.
I'm curious your stance. You mentioned crypto, Bitcoin. With the incumbents, as I already kind of mentioned, Elizabeth Warren, I'm throwing out some names, Christine Lagarde, et cetera, and even Trump, unfortunately, were not friends of Bitcoin. And you mentioned that you're very pro making the dollar strong, and so, of course, having a challenger potentially would weaken the dollar, at least in their viewpoint. So I'm curious your stance on Bitcoin. Are you running on a pro-freedom, pro-choose, pro-opt-out, pro-Bitcoin platform, or does you see that as a threat to the dollar?
No, I don't see it as a threat to the dollar. And I said stabilize the value of the U.S. dollar is what I said. So anti-volatility there. But I actually think that more freedom is good. And I think that this is an occasion to actually cause the existing establishment financial system to look ourselves in the mirror and ask ourselves why we're so threatened by alternatives. Instead, competition breeds innovation. I think that's actually something that those who are even strong proponents of the dollar should actually invite. You don't, hardship is, I say this in sort of cultural contexts, that hardship is not the same thing as victimhood, right? Hardship is what helps you rediscover who you really are. I think that applies equally in this context, right? If having competition could be a form of hardship, that's not victimhood. That can help you rediscover who you are or should be too in the way we run our monetary and financial system here. So that's my broad posture. And I think that actually having the opt-out, I think is a valuable disciplining function. Now, I think that gets complicated when you have people who have engaged in the opt-out, but people who have exchanges, et cetera, say, I want to opt back in, but under selective circumstances and have the best of both worlds. That's where the discussion gets complicated on crypto policy and Bitcoin policy. But in terms of first principles, I'm all in for having a parallel opt-out. And I think that's actually what holds the existing system's feet to the fire for the better.
Yeah. And when you started Strive Asset Management and went kind of on the offensive with that, it's one thing that really brought me to you, and really having that, like, let's just build the world we want. Kind of we can build
totally.
Through a competitive landscape, through what I think is a competitive capitalist system. We can continue to push and progress and provide better. And so I think Bitcoin can work in that way. Stable coins have pushed U.S. dollars dominance all around the world. Mm-hmm. And so it's innovation in the private market, but it's actually done a lot to accelerate and really cement the dollar's position globally. We don't really need a CBDC because the U.S. dollar stablecoin market has already gotten there. So I think that's a good take. I know we're kind of out of time, so I guess we can kind of cut it off there.
I enjoyed it,
taking the time.
And, I think that, look, as a 37-year-old, I'm the first millennial ever to run for U.S. president as a Republican. I've come from innovative backgrounds of having built a multi-billion-dollar biotech company. I, started Strive Asset Management to compete against the ESG cartel. I don't believe that government is the only solution. I happen to be running for president, but I'm not a politician. It's part of why I actually have been trying to deliver most of the solutions I've worked on through the market itself. compete with BlackRock, win that way. And Strive aggregated over $500 million in AUM in its first 3 months after the launch of its first fund last year. So I believe in innovation. I believe in competition. I believe in market solutions, and I believe in winning. I just happen to be running for U.S. president this time because I think we live in a moment where the next U.S. president is well positioned to lead a national revival in a way that I don't think I could or anyone else could in just the private sector alone. And so I think it's the unique moment we live in that calls me into this. And I think we share, a lot of your, Bitcoiners and otherwise, I think we share deep-seated instincts about how reform of the monetary system is right over the target. And I'm not going to be hiding from that. I'm going to make this election in part a referendum on that very set of issues. And so, for folks who want to support me, I appreciate that. We're going to actually look into adding crypto and Bitcoin as ways that people can even contribute to the campaign. Even if it's $1, I want to be at the center of that debate stage, driving this conversation in the Republican Party. And so if people go to vivek2024.com, even if you give $1, that would supercharge this movement and put me in a position to really elevate the conversation you and I have been having, Mark, to the center of that Republican GOP debate stage. If people go to the website and give $1 today, I appreciate it. So thank you for that, man.
Shift the window, put some support. Let's get this conversation going. All right, Vivek, with that, we'll let you go. I appreciate you taking the time, and I'm paying attention. I'm supporting you all along the way.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Take care.
All right, that's a wrap. Hopefully you enjoyed this conversation with Vivek like I did. Boy, he certainly brings a young energy that I think this country could use, and he is crazy smart. And he's got good ideas, and of course, he's not from the establishment. He's from the outside. But do you think an outsider, a young outsider like this, has a chance? I'd like to hear your thought. Leave me a comment down below. Does he have a chance, yes or no? Would you vote for him, yes or no? Let me know in the comments. Of course, as always, give me a thumbs up if you like it. If you don't, give me a thumbs down. That's okay, but leave a comment. Let me know. Subscribe to the channel so you know when I put new videos out, and that's what I got. To your success. I'm out.